friend of a friend of a friend. And somebody said, well, Coach Herrick's in West Virginia. And I reached out and finally found his son, who I'd never met. His son gave me this phone number. I call this phone number. Believe it or not, it's like a VFW in the hills of West Virginia. And Jim Herrick is shooting pool. And this lady's on the phone saying, Coach Herrick, there's this Mark Gottfried calling you. And he picked up the phone. He said, how did you find me? And I said, Coach, don't worry about how I found you. The bottom line is I found you. And I think that made an impression on him as well. And so shortly thereafter, he offered me the opportunity to join his staff.
But before we get going, Mark, as you probably know, I like to hit my guests up with an off-the-wall question or comment to keep you on your toes and keep my audience on their toes. You ready for this?
Let's go.
All right, I'm going to take you back to 1995. You were the assistant coach at UCLA. You guys played my beloved Arkansas Razorbacks in the national championship of NCAA basketball. Arkansas was going for back-to-back national championships, and they were loaded. You guys were the underdog. Tyus Edney, a couple games prior, had won, gone coast to coast with a layup to win the game at the buzzer against the heavily favored Missouri Tigers. Tyus Edney was injured before the game, and he came in and tried to play, but he couldn't. So Cameron Dollar, a very underused, point guard, came in and helped. You guys ended up winning the game in the national championship, breaking my hearts and the hearts of the entire Arkansas Razorback Nation. My question for you, Mark, and I want you to be 1,000% honest here. How did you cheat?
There's no cheating involved there, but that was an amazing night. And there's so many stories around it, but the after effect of that game was the visit to the White House with your beloved former governor, Bill Clinton, who we had a wonderful day with him in the White House when we gave him the UCLA jersey to wear. How about that? Or to put on. But we had fun. But that was a magical run and a magical night back in 1995.
That's awesome. I hope Bill Clinton accused you of cheating at the White House too, for that matter. Hey, as you guys can tell, I've got as my guest Mark Gottfried. He is a basketball coach at heart. He is a master storyteller. He's the host of Front Row Podcast. He's probably best known as head coach for a University of Alabama for about 10 or so years in the late 90s, early 2000s. He was a coach at NC State, assistant coach at UCLA, as I mentioned, and he has been an ESPN color analyst for a number of years, or was an ESPN color analyst. So welcome to Unlocking Moves, Mark Gottfried.
My pleasure, Kurt. I'm glad to be on your show.
Well, we're excited to have you. I know you're a basketball coach, as I said. My audience is mostly entrepreneurs and people around entrepreneurs and business leaders, but there's a lot of similarities between being a coach and being a CEO. But I want to start with some context. Would you mind sharing at a high level some of your background going from a high school player in Illinois to being ultimately assistant coach at UCLA and head coach at Bama?
Well, when I played, my father was a high school coach and then a small college basketball coach. And, I always had a dream to play at the highest level of college basketball. I was more of a college guy than a pro guy. I had followed college my whole life because my dad coached at a small college. But, I had set some goals as a ninth grader that I wanted to reach. And, I'm a goal setter. And I always tell the story, what I did with my goals. I put them on a 5x7 card and I taped them to the side of my bed. And so that every morning and every night I had to look at it and either ask myself the question, what did I do today that would push me towards my goals? And anyway, I was fortunate to have a nice high school career. Played on 3 amazing teams at Alabama. All 3 of the years I played there, we went to the Sweet 16. And my last year, we were a 2 seed in the NCAA tournament and got knocked out by Rick Pitino and Billy Donovan, the Providence Friars, in 1987. And I was playing in the NBA Pro Summer League. I got drafted by the Detroit Pistons in 87. I came back in 88. I had played with a team called Athletes in Action in the fall of 87 and the spring of 88. But Detroit signed me again as a free agent. I went to the summer league with Detroit. And at that time, I had a phone call from the brand new coach at UCLA, Jim Herrick. And he kind of tracked me down. He didn't know I was in LA. It's an interesting story, but that was before cell phones. And you go back to the hotel and the little red light is blinking on the phone. You got a message. And so I call, and it's my mom back in Mobile, Alabama. And she said, there's this Jim Herrick guy called you from UCLA. And so I got up the next morning. I got a taxi back then. This was pre-Ubers and Lyft and all that stuff. And I zipped over to UCLA. I walked in his office. I stuck my hand out. I said, Coach, I'm Mark Gottfried. And there it began. I was still actually playing with Detroit at the time, but that's where the relationship began. And I ended up having the opportunity to join his staff at UCLA.
Man, I want to dive into so much of that. And by the way, I feel like I'm in a time machine going back to all these. Did you get on the payphone at some point as well? But listen, hey, I love what you said about setting goals and setting a reminder for yourself. There's a lot of lessons that our audience can learn from that. And then asking yourself, what did you do towards that goal today to make you work you towards that goal? I really appreciate that story. I want to come back to maybe you don't know, but why did Jim Herrick reach out to you? And I love the story about your mom leaving the message at the hotel.
That my year after I was drafted in '87 and got cut by Detroit, I played with Athletes in Action. And during that year, I was kind of in that place where I love to play, but I also felt like, maybe it's time for me to start transitioning into coaching. I always knew I wanted to coach. And so what I did is I got a piece of paper and I made a list of probably every coach I could think of that I either met or knew or competed against or and just sent letters out. The standard letter, hey, I'd love to join your staff in any role possible, even as a graduate assistant. I want to learn. And, I got a lot of letters back from people that, they didn't have openings at the time. And so I had sent a bunch out and just kind of left it alone for a little bit. And evidently, something in my letter must have caught Jim Herrick's mind. He later told me he had about 300 people that wanted to be the graduate assistant. And, he had watched me play at Alabama. He was the coach at Pepperdine before UCLA. And anyway, I think that the morning after the call, when I went to his office, I think that impressed him. And, but then it was about a month before he made his decision. And I went into full recruiting mode. And it was actually a great story one night. He had been named the coach at UCLA in April of 1988. And, he got settled in and he took off and went back to West Virginia where he was from. And a friend of mine, I kind of went through a friend of a friend of a friend. And somebody said, well, Coach Herrick's in West Virginia. And I reached out and finally found his son, who I'd never met. His son gave me this phone number. I call this phone number. Believe it or not, it's like a VFW in the hills of West Virginia. And Jim Herrick is shooting pool. And this lady's on the phone saying, Coach Herrick, there's this Mark Gottfried calling you. And he picked up the phone. He said, how did you find me? And I said, Coach, don't worry about how I found you. The bottom line is I found you. And I think that made an impression on him as well. And so shortly thereafter, he offered me the opportunity to join his staff.
Mark, there is gold in that story, man. Let me recap that for the audience. So we have Mark not only sent out hundreds of letters unsolicited to college coaches to seek that opportunity, college grads, anybody looking for a career change, seek that advice, use that advice that Mark just gave you. Number two, you track after the meeting, which was a little bit by chance, but after the meeting, well, I guess you impressed him in LA, but after the meeting, you tracked him down in West Virginia. Not many people are going to do that. People are saying Mark Gottfried's so lucky. Mark Gottfried busted his ass for that opportunity. And that is just such a great story, Mark. Thanks for sharing that.
Well, thank you. And what was interesting too, Kurt, is, once I started, it was the fall. I was a graduate student at UCLA. I got into graduate school and, people don't really know exactly what that is. You're really like an intern. You're kind of learning, but at the same time, you're going to school. You're not making any money at all. You're basically on like a scholarship. I'm getting a stipend to go, eat at the time. But I remember one thing Coach told me. I walked in on the first day, the very first day I was there, and he looked me right in the eye and he said, Mark, if I have to tell you what to do every day, I've hired the wrong guy. And it made an impression on me. And so what my intention was at that point is I just tried to find ways. I asked every assistant coach, what can I do to help you today? You want me to run envelopes down to the post office? You want me to stuff envelopes? You want me to, whatever you want me to do, I'm going to do. And rather than sit back and kind of wait for them to tell me what to do, I was going to figure out how can I make an impact and how can I contribute, even as a young person, to the staff that year. And I was very fortunate because at the end of that first year, Kurt, we had one of our full-time assistants that was out recruiting. He ended up becoming a head coach, and Jim Herrick promoted me that after 1 year. So now I'm one of the full-time assistants at UCLA. I'm 24, 25 years old. And, from there, I was kind of on that path.
Wow. There's so much about that story too that people can glean. I love that quote. If I have to tell you what to do every day, I hired the wrong person. Any intern, again, any person new in their career, take that advice. Do whatever it takes to impress the people that you work with, and the world's your oyster. Absolutely. Hey, by the way, we glossed over the fact that you were drafted by the Bad Boys, who were a badass team in the late 80s. So congratulations on that. Even though you got cut, it's still got to be great.
It was a wonderful experience. And on my podcast, I just had Jermaine Dye, who was the MVP of the 2015 World Series for the White Sox. And we talked about this. And, I remember the day, I had gone through rookie camp with Detroit in 87. They had, if people can remember this, and the basketball fans will, but in 86, they lost to the Boston Celtics in the Eastern Conference Finals. Larry Bird stole the ball on an inbound pass and made this incredible pass to Dennis Johnson. The Celtics win the game. The Pistons are out. And this is now this fall, a couple months later. And I made it through rookie camp. And now I'm with the veterans. There's about 16 of us, and they've got to cut it down to 12. But I remember walking into the locker room there, and you kind of get into that locker, and you see the locker, and you see your name on the back of a jersey for picture day, for media day. And that was one of those for me. Even though I didn't have a long NBA career, it was still a memorable moment where you kind of look back as like, wow, okay. And I've got Isaiah Thomas and Joe Dumars and Vinnie Johnson and Bill Laimbeer. They're all in the locker room with me. But seeing my name on that jersey was a fun moment for me as an athlete.
Well, I want to stay on this topic for a second because you fulfilled a dream from putting the card on your bedside for your early days. You fulfilled a dream, but then your dream was shattered because you were cut ultimately. But you turned that into success, obviously, as a coach. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Because you took what a lot of people would take as a heartbreak and woe is me and whatever, and you turned it into a fantastic career. With so my fans know who are watching this on video, right behind you is a jersey with the number 400 on it, which indicates over 400 wins as a coach. So you're a badass coach, by the way.
Well, thank you, Kurt. I'm going to tell you the quick story on this jersey right over my head. I was coaching at NC State, and we'll go back to the Pistons in a second, but this is actually a Detroit Pistons jersey. What's interesting about this jersey is I'm coaching at NC State, and one of my teams, we had to go play in Cameron Indoor against Duke. Very, very difficult place to play. It's like a cathedral. It's a small, tight arena there. And I had 399 wins at the time. And my team beat Duke at Duke. And a couple weeks after that, I get a package at my mailbox. And when I open it up, it's from Stan Van Gundy. And Stan was the head coach of the Detroit Pistons at the time. And he sent me a jersey with my name on it with 400 for the 400th win. And he wrote me a really nice letter of congratulations. But what he didn't realize was he didn't even realize that in 1987, I had been drafted by Detroit. And so I found the letter of draft day in 1987. I put them both together, had them framed. But that ended up being a Detroit Pistons jersey years later after I had been cut by Detroit, drafted, then cut. And so this one ended up, this jersey is a whole lot of fun. But like you said, Kurt, when you get cut, it's a difficult thing. And I remember kind of going home back to Alabama and felt a little beat up and felt a little bit, down about the fact that, I was right there and just couldn't get over the hump. And I ended up playing with a team called Athletes in Action for that year. And then Detroit called me back. They wanted me to come back and give it another shot, which I did. And that was about the same time in my mind I was trying to figure out if I still wanted to play or if I wanted to coach. And so in the long run, it all worked out. But whenever you're cut from something, it's not a lot of fun, and it's not a great feeling.
Well, what's the old adage? When one door closes, another one opens, and obviously you opened up another one. So, okay. So thank you for the background, and let's shift gears because I know that you're known as the turnaround coach, and I want to learn a little bit about that because that'll maybe take us into some of the other years after UCLA.
Well, in coaching, I think it's very similar to business. There's a lot of times when, it's a CEO or someone in any leadership position where the program is suffering. They're not doing a great job. It's kind of stale. There's a lot of mediocrity. And a lot of times that's why there's a change. And in sports, that's why there's a change a lot of times in coaching. And just about every job that I had, even while I was an assistant at UCLA, people don't realize that the 7 years prior to Jim Herrick taking over, which I was on that first staff with him, I ended up staying at UCLA 7 years, but they'd only been to the NCAA tournament twice in 7-year period, which for UCLA, that's not acceptable. And, they're used to winning national championships. John Wooden won 10 out of 12 years. And the bar is very, very high at UCLA. So UCLA was struggling, and we had to develop a philosophy. We had to believe in the philosophy and then stay with the philosophy, which we did at UCLA. And I got the job at Murray State. And Murray State was a program that had traditionally won, and they had struggled a little bit, and they weren't where they wanted to be. And it was kind of that first opportunity for me as the head coach to kind of implement, those things I believed in to try to turn that around. Alabama then followed. Alabama had great success when I played there, great success after I played there. And then they hit a real lull in the program's history. Same at NC State, and the list goes on and on. So, a lot of times it's the ability to paint a picture, to share a vision. Here's what it's going to look like. This is what your program's going to look like in time. And we were able to do that along the way.
So is that the secret? Creating a vision, but there's a lot more to that, execution and so forth. Tell me about some of those stories.
I think the number one thing I share with people, Kurt, is you do have to be able to share your vision of what it will look like when we're done, or when we get going, or when we start to really feel like we're in a position where we're going to win. And in basketball, it's a little bit different, but we wanted to recruit high character young men who are still good basketball players. I used to say I wanted NBA people who potentially might be NBA players, but I want NBA character level people. And I wanted kids that wanted to graduate, that were going to represent the school well. I wanted my staff to do the same thing, and how we interacted in the community. And we wanted to play a tough schedule. We wanted to go find the best teams and toughest teams to play. And so again, I think from the time that you have that first meeting with your team, it's your ability. I think it's any coach's ability or any leader's ability to paint the picture, share the vision. Here's where we're striving to be. Here's where we want to go to. Here's what we want it to look like. And then here's how we're going to get there. Here are the tools along the way that's going to help us to reach those goals. So for me, I've always believed that sharing that vision, creating a vision, and creating the ability to describe what it's going to look like, I think that's really important.
Man, that sounds like coaching 101, but also leadership 101 is creating a vision that you can share and people buy into, and then marching towards it every step of the way. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. If you're just joining us on Unlocking Moves, today's episode is brought to you as usual by Hire Better, the strategic talent partner for growth-minded entrepreneurs everywhere. Okay. You also have a I want to mention a quote that I've heard you mention before. You mentioned John Wooden a second ago, and there's one quote in particular that really struck me. It's about teamwork and team spirit. And the quote is, "It's amazing what can be accomplished when no one cares who gets the credit." I love that. Tell me more about that.
Well, Kurt, I think in any organization, especially in sports, that's paramount. I don't think you can win without that. I really don't. I don't think you may have some temporary wins and you might have temporary success along the way. And if you're leading a business, leading a group of people, I think it's the leader's job to create an atmosphere where everybody understands that it is collectively where everybody is pulling on the rope in the same direction. And I think what John Wooden, he had so many quotes and so many things that he would say, probably the wisest person I've ever been around. But when he told me that, he said, it's amazing what can be accomplished when no one cares who gets the credit. And if you can achieve that in any organization where nobody cares who gets the credit, I think the downfall of most organizations, the downfall of most teams and probably coaches is when all that selfishness begins to creep in and people are now starting to look out for themselves and they want the credibility. They want to stand on the top box and get all the attention. If you can put a group of people together that can lay all that down and say, you know what, nothing's more important than the team's success, which, in coaching, it's getting harder and harder because young people are much different. But it's still in my view, the driving force behind championship level program, championship level businesses.
It's absolutely the team's ability to come together and for a common cause. So you've said the two biggest things right there. One is we have a vision, we're going towards a common cause, and we've got a team that's focused on the team versus self. Love that. So you also have I'll call it a theory or a mentality that you really aspire to, and that is get it done. Tell me about that. I know you've talked about that in other places, but I want to hear what you have to say about get it done.
At the end of the day, it's something that years ago, we kind of came up with, and I'm going to tell you the story behind where it originated with get it done. But, I think in anything, well, first of all, in life, forget coaching, forget business, forget everything else. In life, we all have to develop that. You better have a get it done mentality or you're probably not going to get very far in life, period. And that means fighting through difficult times and overcoming obstacles, having what I call grit, integrity, and desire, the GID of actually get it done, the acronym. But in 2004, we were playing in the NCAA tournament. I was the head coach at Alabama. And our team was 16-12, sitting there on Selection Sunday, March Madness. Everybody in America's got their bracket out and the pencil out, and they're going to pick their teams once the bracket is done. Alabama was the last team announced. We were the last team in, and a lot of times what they do in the tournament is they stick you in the 8 seed versus 9 seed game. I used to call that the booby prize game because you get in, but if you win that game, you have to play the 1 seed the next game, who is obviously one of the top 4 teams in the country. And that year, in March of 2004, we beat Southern Illinois in the first game, and now we're playing Stanford. Stanford was 30-1. They were the number 1 team in the country. They were the 1 seed of the ones, and they were really good. And obviously, there was a lot of people that year that picked Stanford possibly to win the national championship. At halftime, the score is 39-36. We're down by 3. We've actually played pretty well. And I had a team of just tough-minded, get-it-done guys. I mean, that's just the way they were. Even though our record wasn't great, they had high character. And we come out of the halftime, Kurt, and believe it or not, we missed our first 17 shots of the second half. Luckily, we were only down by, I think, 8 at the time or 10. And we come to a timeout. And the heads are down. And I think our guys were somewhat in that place where their mind was saying, you know what? We've had a great run. We've made it to the tournament. We're playing the number 1 team in the country, for goodness sake. And I just remember sitting there, and we were in Seattle, Washington. And I told them, I said, guys, right now, this is a get it done moment. This is a GID moment, period. Same's going to happen in your life. You're going to be faced with this situation right here, right now. We can fold it up. We can say we had a good year, or we can find a way to get it done. And what I remember, Kurt, is they walked away from me, and they were about 5 feet away from me, the 5 guys on the floor. And all I could hear was GID, get it done. And we went out after that timeout, boom, made a 3-pointer, boom, another 3-pointer, boom, here we come. And we marched all the way back, and we ended up winning the game 70-67, upset the #1 team in the country. But the most important part of that for me was, even if we would have lost the game, I knew at that moment they got it. They got it. They understood GID, what it meant, dig deep, find a way, and they got it done. And that's really kind of where the GID mentality kind of was birthed on that day.
Man, I was so hoping I was going to hear a coach speak moment where you could fire me up to go run through that brick wall. You just did it, man. Thank you, Mark. I love that. Actually, I can't call you Mark anymore. I got to call you Coach after that. I love that. That's fantastic. Well, my next topic was actually very similar to this topic. So let me kind of do a nice little segue. You said, even if we lose, we still learn the lesson. Talk to me about losses. Everybody talks about your 400 wins, yada, yada bullshit. I want to hear other things you learned besides GID in a moment of adversity or losses.
It's interesting, Kirk, because when I speak a lot, I was fortunate, and we won a lot of games. But I often tell people, my team's lost 200. I think it's 293 games. That's a lot of games.
You suck, Coach.
And what happens is, it's interesting. Sometimes we as coaches and people, we remember those losses. Like, they don't leave us, and they're difficult. And I think what happens is, and it's one of the reasons why, as a coach, I always wanted to play really difficult non-conference schedules. I wanted to get tested. I wanted my team to get tested. I wanted to find out what we needed to work on and how we were going to become good. And sometimes I always used to say it's a tad bit cowardly, but coaches like to load up and play about 15 straight games against the Sisters of the Poor. And I just don't know that you ever learn much about your team. And so I think sometimes for all of us, even in any organization, those difficult times, the tough tests, the tough challenges, that's where you learn about yourself, what you're good at, where your weaknesses are. Without those, I'm not sure you learn much. And so even though the losses, and we have losses in life, usually when we look back on those, we recognize that's where we took the biggest steps forward, is after the losses, after the tough ones, after getting punched in the gut. And also not being naive to think that those situations are going to be exempt for you. They're not. We're all going to face them one way or another, in business and our personal lives. And I think that's where we learn the most about who we are and how we improve. And so even though they're difficult, I think they're necessary, and it's what makes us better.
Man, I hope my audience takes that home. You learn so much in your losses. What you do afterwards is what's most important. No one goes through life unscathed. And as I say, you learn a lot from the shit shows, more so than sometimes you do the glory shows. So appreciate that. So one more coaching question, and that is, I know you were an assistant coach. You've also been a head coach. In the business world, we have CEOs, and it's often lonely at the top. Tell me a little bit about being lonely at that head coach level.
It's a great question, and I'm going to tell you a story about that one. So when I was a graduate assistant coach, I think I was 24 years old, maybe 20, probably 24. And UCLA is playing at Cal, and we had a shoot around the night of the game or the morning of the game at about 11 o'clock. We played that evening, and we're on the bus leaving the hotel, going to the gym at Cal Berkeley, and I move up and sit in the front seat with Jim Herrick. And we're sitting there side by side, and I turned to my right and I looked at him. I said, "Coach, what's the biggest difference between being a head coach and an assistant coach?" And honestly, I was expecting this real elaborate, amazing, profound answer. I was ready for the story. Here it comes. And he looked around a little bit, and he looked over his left shoulder right at me. And he just looked and said, lonely. That was the only thing he said. And I remember looking at him like, whoa, okay. And not only was it profound, when I became a head coach, he was right. And, what happens is when you sit in that seat and the buck stops with you, which is a great position to be in. I loved being a head coach. I loved being in charge. But there are a lot of times when you shut the door and you've taken all the input. I've taken all the input from my assistants, and they've made some amazing suggestions, some good, some bad, some I like, and I've taken all those suggestions. You shut the door and you realize I have to make the decision. And I think that's something that it's a wonderful thing, but it is lonely. And understanding, again, when you lose a game, the assistants go home and they have dinner, and the head coach, you stare at the ceiling all night. I lay in bed and I see every crack in the ceiling for about 7 straight hours. I can't sleep. So it's part of the turf.
I'm sure the assistant coaches don't have 1,000 for sale signs in their yard after a big loss, right?
No.
Did that ever happen to you? Do you ever have any for sale signs? When
I never had that, but there were probably a few people that wanted to put some in there. I could probably do that.
Oh, that's great. Okay, we're at the point of the show where I want to ask you about your unlocking move, which again is a big decision point or key inflection point to change the trajectory of your career. You got one or two in mind?
Well, I think for me, it's a great question, by the way. And so if we go back to when I sent out all those letters to coaches, and I was a young guy, I was playing for the Detroit Pistons in the LA Pro Summer League back then. And my college coach, who I have great respect for, I loved playing for Wimp Sanderson. He was a really good coach at Alabama. He called and offered me an opportunity to come back and be the graduate assistant coach. I was going to get married in August of that year in '88, and my wife at the time, she still had another year of school left. And so it was the easiest decision I could have made to go back to my alma mater. I had played there. I had started 98 straight games. Now I've got a chance to be a graduate assistant coach at Alabama. At the same time, Jim Herrick, the ball was rolling at UCLA, and he hadn't offered me a job yet. And here was the interesting part. Alabama is on semesters, and they start school end of August. UCLA's on quarters. They don't start till September. And Jim Herrick wasn't in a hurry to make a decision. It took him probably 2 or 3 or 4 weeks before he decided. So I turned the Alabama job down without the UCLA job offered to me yet. But I knew in my gut, if in fact Jim Herrick offers me a chance to join a staff at UCLA, the UCLA name, the tradition, the connection to John Wooden, I knew that it would catapult my career in a whole different direction. Nothing against Alabama. Loved Wimp, still do to this day. But I turned that one down, knowing that if I can get the one at UCLA, it changes the game for me. So for me, if I look back on my coaching career, and I think probably either way it would have worked out, but I became a Division I head coach when I was 30 years old at Murray State. I'm not sure that would have happened if I went to Alabama. And the national media, the national news, and obviously in '95, we won the national championship at UCLA. And I was a part of that. So it ended up being, a pretty good move for me.
Man, what a great story. And taking the risk to do that, trusting your gut. And it's funny how it came full circle. Ultimately, you got the head coaching job at Alabama. So that was really interesting. I loved the fact that you took that risk. And most entrepreneurs have to take a risk. They've got to put their paycheck on the line, their whatever on the line, make it happen. Okay, so I know you've been a coach. I don't know, I can't remember how long you've been retired, to be honest, but tell me what you're doing now. Now you've got Front Row Podcasts and you're speaking. Tell me a little bit about what you've got next.
Well, those are the two things. I have had just an absolute blast with my podcast. I've had some amazing guests, and a little bit like yourself, Kurt, I want to have high achieving people, and I want to try to draw out their stories and the things that, that highlighted their career and some of the struggles they've had. And I've had some amazing people. I've had 7 national championship coaches, a Super Bowl coach. I've had 2 NBA World Championships, a college NBA Player of the Year. I've had an actor, Cedric the Entertainer, who has his hand in the Walk of Fame in Hollywood. But the podcast has been a lot of fun, and it's also a great learning opportunity for me, hopefully for all of my guests, but for me as well. And then at the same time, I've kind of launched a corporate keynote speaking career. It's been really fun trying to get that off the ground. And again, where you walk in front of corporate audiences, and I think what happens a lot of time, and we've talked about this, is, people become complacent. People become somewhat stale at times. And hopefully what I can do is help wake them up and, instill a GID mentality, a get it done mentality for organizations in the corporate world as well. So that's been a lot of fun for me as well.
Well, I wish you the best with Front Row Podcast. It's really cool. You have a lot of interesting guests on, and especially if you're a sports fan, there's some great content there. So I've got 2 other questions for you. The first one is, I call it my listener's advocate question. I consider myself the listener's advocate. If I've got, Mark Gottfried here I can ask him any question I want. What would I want Kurt to ask? Honestly, you've already answered several, but here's the one that I come down to. You coached at Alabama, which is the #1 brand football of all time. You coached during some pretty good years where they had some pretty good football teams, not as great as the run they just had. But what was that like being a basketball coach at a football school with such a great tradition?
Kurt, it was wonderful. I loved my experience at Alabama. The athletic director at the time, Mal Moore, he had worked for Bear Bryant years and years ago, and probably one of the greatest people, one of the greatest individuals I've ever been around. And so I was a coach at Alabama for 11 years. Interestingly, they had 5 different head football coaches during that 11-year period, which was amazing. My last year and a half, I overlapped with Nick Saban. And looking back, Kurt, I would say this, the brand of Alabama is such a great national brand. And, our teams had some success in basketball. We had been to the Elite 8. We were ranked #1 in the country, the only time in school history. And I began to get a little frustrated. I wanted them to help basketball more. And, it is a football school. It's going to be a football school from now to the end of time. And people in that state love football, and deservingly so. They've had just an amazing run. But, I was kind of young and dumb. I was a little bit, I think if I was a little bit older, I'd have handled it better. But I started getting a little grumpy because, I was fighting for Alabama basketball. Hey, we need this and facilities, and I need extra money to hire a certain coach, and, all the things. And, football, obviously, they were, when they hired Nick Saban, they gave him the keys to the kingdom. And so I wasn't probably the happiest guy on the planet, but, it was a great experience. When you bring a young person into Bryant-Denny Stadium and you walk them out of that tunnel and put your feet on the grass about 30 seconds before that first kickoff, and you got 110,000 people singing "Sweet Home Alabama," it's a pretty good thing to have. So I had a great run. I loved my 11 years there, and I wouldn't trade them for anything.
Fantastic. Well, I didn't mean for this podcast to become an Alabama recruiting video. I need to put my hog hat back on and see if I can get John Calipari on the show. So, hey, I've got one last question for you. It's kind of a trick question. And that is, tell me one question that you're never asked, and either you're glad they don't ask, or you kind of wish they would.
I think what happens a lot of times, Kurt, is the question I think a lot of people don't ask a lot of times, for all of us, is kind of what's really going on inside, because we can all kind of portray a persona. Coaches do it, leaders do it, high successful people do it, celebrities do it. But a lot of times it's the question of what's really going on in your gut. Because I think we all experience the same things. We experience fear and we experience uncertainty. There are some days we're really confident, some days we're a little bit unsure. And what I've always wanted to be with people is to be authentic. And I've never been really good at not being authentic. But I think a lot of times, we see, those coaches, hold the trophy above their head. We see the championships. But what we don't see so many times is there's a lot of pain at times that for all of us in our personal lives, professional lives. And so, and even on my podcast, I try to find those with guys and gals to say, because we all have them, we're not exempt. And so just digging deeper into everybody's, just deep in their gut, I think that's the one.
Well, thank you for that. And I'll say that it is an issue with men and women too, but men for sure. We don't talk about our feelings or our challenges, and we have this mask that we wear. And I heard had a couple of guests on my podcast who have said things along this line. One of them was he wants to understand, who are you? Not what do you do, but who are you? And the other is just the podcast that just released today was Charles Choice, and he said, if you're looking for a job, consider who you want to be before you consider what you want to do. And so all very powerful in the lives of our mental health and our next generation. So thank you, Mark. Hey, on that note, we're going to wrap this puppy up. Mark Gottfried, thank you so much for joining me on Unlocking Moves. I'm going to encourage all of our viewers and listeners to please go like and subscribe on Unlocking Moves wherever you consume your podcast: Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and Coach. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me.